Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
What's the darkest side of humanity you've ever seen? 3 years ago, I was driving in the countryside on my way home. I was on an incredibly quiet road when I noticed a group of ducks crossing the road, so I stopped to let them pass. Soon after, I saw an oncoming vehicle with a man driving towards me from the other side. I used my headlights to signal him to stop and let the duck pass. He also saw the ducks, because it seemed like he was responding to my request to stop. He slowed down as he approached the ducks, but then suddenly accelerated, killing a large number of baby ducklings. I felt sick to my stomach witnessing the carnage. And while he was driving beside me, he was smiling, as if relishing the notion that he had caused harm to the ducklings. I got out of my car and tried to say something, but he sped off. Some people are just messed up. My stepdad was a bad person, but he was bad at it. He even tried to create his own gang, but everyone that he tried to recruit was a lot more dangerous than he was. Some of them agreed to be a part of it, but you could always tell it had the same air as a big brother patting his younger sibling on the head and telling them they're doing an excellent job. As a kid watching all this unfold, there were times I'd be embarrassed of him, not just because he was attempting to do horrible things, but that he did them in such a childish way. But there was a chain of events that seemed to flip all of it around. My grandfather ran a tattoo shop out of his home and usually accepted different drugs as payment, so there were a lot of shady people hanging around. My stepdad always put on this machismo show when we'd go over there and pretended he ran the place. He was always loud, saying stupid things, and running around acting tough. But there was this one guy who came for a tattoo. He had bodyguards, and the whole vibe of everyone changed immediately. Even my stepdad sat down and was silent the entire time. I was put in another room but could still feel how tense everyone was. It was strange. He wasn't even a scary-looking guy. Tall, pretty skinny, dressed normally, but wore these cowboy boots with giant spurs. He even had a hat to match it. He hung around for a couple of hours, got a tattoo, and left. But on the way out he noticed that someone had stolen some rims out of the back of his truck and demanded that they figure it out or he would. My grandfather had cameras everywhere, so we were easily able to find who it was. Just some man who came over semi-often and was always stealing whatever he could pawn. When he showed up next, it was about 10 p.m. on a school night, but I was brought along anyhow. My stepdad and a couple other guys beat him for well over 3 hours. The things I saw, heard, and smelled have stayed with me. They broke his legs, let a dog maul him, beat him with bats, split his skull, broke as many ribs as they could. There was blood, vomit, and his feces everywhere in the room. He lived, somehow, but was in the hospital for the better part of a year. All my nightmares are about this night. Their laughter was sadistic and sticks really well in my mind. But the sounds he made, gurgling and all, are what really bothered me. He sounded like a dying animal, which I guess he was, but when the hope slipped away from him, it was crushing. One time I found a sponge ball with a smiley face on it lying around in the ground. We have these here as stress-busting balls. This ground is a place where there have been fights between animal feeders and local residents. So, without much thought, I picked up the ball and squashed it because, well, it's spongy, you know. Guess what? My hand starts bleeding because there are a bunch of nails inside. I figured, because of the altercations I've seen here before, someone put nails in the ball and threw it so some dog bites on it and gets hurt. I can't even say if some dog did get hurt inside the mouth, and this perhaps is not a big deal considering the things we see every day, but for someone to take their anger out on an animal like that because they don't agree with people feeding them there, this act must come from the lowest, darkest side of their humanity. I spent a few weeks working in a gender-based violence center in Kenya. There was a tally on the wall with the number of victims in each age group who had attended, and there were so many under the age of 5. More harrowing was doing safety check visits and finding child trafficking victims chained up. I was only 20 at the time, and it really, massively shaped how I interact with the world. It made this summer the year before when I worked in a children's hospice seem like a dream. For context, I'm from Myanmar and we are currently in civil war. From that, I've seen the darkest side of humanity. The whole village where civilians resided got burned down by the military, and the soldiers dismembered the bodies of the villagers and displayed the heads at the entrance of a village. Those photos got leaked on Facebook, and man, that's the oddest thing I've ever witnessed a human can do to another human. I couldn't believe that medieval things happened even though we are living in the 21st century. My dad is a truck driver, and when I was little, he worked for a place that didn't care if we tagged along on trips with him. Well, one winter, we ended up stranded at a truck stop in Montana because the blizzards were so intense. There were a bunch of other people that got stuck there and more who showed up as the roads gradually became impassable and they had to abandon their cars. It was mostly fine at first, but as the days dragged on, all the people started to separate into groups, like little makeshift alliances. The shelves were quickly emptied of all the food and supplies and hoarded. Cabin fever set in, and people started getting into arguments that sometimes escalated to fights. The store staff were initially doing their best to keep the peace, but eventually they stopped trying and stayed in the break room. My dad and I stayed by ourselves, and out of all that mess, unfortunately he's a tough-looking guy, so no one tried anything, but it was getting very tense when it finally let up. We ended up being stuck there for 4 days. It really showed me how under the right circumstances, society can break down fast. Made me afraid of people for a long time. First responder to a major motor vehicle accident involving 2 cars. Check first car and lone driver is very obviously deceased. Move to the other side of the road to check on occupants of another car. Couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 minutes checking on them, minor injuries for both occupants. When I turn back to the first car, I see someone has opened the trunk and is taking suitcases out. I stop them, put them on the ground as other patrols and fire/rescue arrive. The person later admitted that they didn't see me and thought they would get away with the theft as the driver, obviously dead, meaning they checked, wouldn't need the suitcases or what was in them. My wife and I were going to the grocery store one evening after work. It was fun, and we were just talking about owning pets. Now, I'm deathly allergic to cat danger and have developed a disdain towards our feline friends. But with that being said, I would never act on those feelings at all. So, we turned down this road that had a gas station on the right, but the store we were going to was straight ahead. My wife saw something in the road and told me to look out, so I saw it too. It was a kitten. It was cute and confusing on the road. It wasn't exactly in the road but on the side, enough for when a car passed it kind of flinched. My wife loves animals and tells me to pull over, which I did. I wanted to help her, but allergies would flare up and it would be a whole other issue to deal with. Well, she gets out of the car and runs to the kitten, waiting for a few cars to pass. Hell, some slowed down to see what she was doing. But God, I'll never forget this. This guy in a truck that could only say, "My dick is too small," saw the kitten and purposefully turned just enough to hit it. Ran over the head. My wife stopped, stunned at what this man did. Even I jumped out of the car to yell at him. But as the guy drove off, he was flipping us off. Wife was standing there, staring at this cat who was going to die in mere minutes, walk drunkenly and fall down. If you're out there, man, hate you for everything you stand for. Not directly, but the Manchester Arena bombing really got me, for a few reasons. I'd been stood in the spot the bomb went off a few days earlier, I had friends working at the arena, and a friend of my wife's was killed. The biggest thing for me was that the demographic at the concert was predominantly young girls, hardly a geopolitical threat. This guy stood there, watching them leave the arena, having had a wonderful time, probably looking them in the eye, and was still filled with enough hatred to press the button. Terrorism is horrific regardless, but this felt evil in a way I'd not considered before. I was so angry in the days after that I struggled to breathe at times. I'd never felt anything quite like it. I was walking in Toronto and found a woman lying on the sidewalk. I walked over to her and shook her a bit while dialing 911, and she started coming to and making some noise. Because it was winter, she had melted into the ice and her skin had frozen to the sidewalk, so when the paramedics arrived they had to slowly defrost her from the ground. She had soiled herself in -10°C and had been laying on the cold pavement on the ice. She was in and out of consciousness. She would have to have been laying there for a while for this to happen. The thousands of people who walked by before us had walked right on by a woman lying in -10°C weather on the pavement completely still. So, when I think of the darkest side of humanity, I think of indifference. The blind uninterested way we walk around, while people slowly freeze to the ground, their skin being peeled away while paramedics try to save them from hypothermia. A homeless shelter kicked a man out for soiling himself into 30-degree weather. He stayed out front for at least 12 hours, during which time sleet came through. They called the police on him at about 7 a.m., then the police called for an ambulance. His clothes were frozen stiff, and he had frostbite in both feet and couldn't walk. The shelter couldn't have called sooner to trespass him. They let him basically freeze overnight, and it's a wonder he wasn't a human popsicle by the time I was called to get him. I dated a girl for quite some time. We were engaged actually, and one day we were driving down the highway and there was a really bad accident on the side of the road. As we passed by them, she looked over and started to laugh. I asked her why she was laughing because it was a pretty bad accident, like people had probably died bad, and was genuinely concerned and confused how she could possibly find this funny. Her reply was, "Because it's not us, so that makes it really funny, right?" I told her no, that's not how things work, and it was at that moment I realized what was actually going on, and all these years she had me convinced that I was just really bad at communicating how much her actions were hurting myself and others. In fact, it was the complete opposite. I was really good at communicating and she was getting off on it. I broke up with her shortly after and never spoke to her again, but she did end up getting married and having kids, so she is still out there living in society being a sociopath and abusing people. My friend was waiting at a bus stop outside of his uni. 3 kids rode up on bikes with a gun and robbed him. They got mad because all he had was $17. They proceeded to beat the hell out of him, breaking bones all over. He said that in between punches he made eye contact with passing people, begging for help. Grown men, 2 police officers, all drove by. Know who stopped helping him? An 80-year-old woman, on her way to church. She stopped right in traffic, walked up to the boy about to shoot him, and ran them off. We are our brother's keeper, and on the day grown men wouldn't help, it took a little old lady to keep him. I've mentioned it in another recent comment, but I once saw a young boy, about 13, attempting to suicide bomb a market in a local that was relatively friendly towards U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. He was young and likely recruited by a trusted adult. One who was also likely radicalized during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. He never participated in the planning, construction of the device, or choosing of the target. He didn't even have control of the device's cell phone trigger mechanism. He was most likely in the dark the whole time. Most of the victims would have been people living in or near his neighborhood. Not U.S. soldiers. He was under the impression that the device was to bring the word of Allah to the people of his home. He didn't know that he would die. He only failed because his handler either lost his nerve or had a malfunction in the trigger. The man we think built the bomb or who taught how to build the bomb was from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I think about this whenever I hear about a bomb maker being killed while training suicide bombers. Visited my uncle in New York once. Was walking down the street and saw 2 police officers beating the ever-living out of someone. I later found out all he did was steal a pack of cigarettes from the convenience store around the block. Another thing that comes to mind is how cruel kids can be. Went to school with a kid that was a little strange. He was nice and polite, just had odd interests and was more introverted than most. He got bullied so badly in late elementary school and middle school that he's basically still a basket case. Excluded from everything, constantly made fun of, beaten up or at least hit on a regular basis, etc. Hurts to know that he's still in pain and stuff, all because some kids decided to make his life hell for no reason. Large groups of people. When you have large groups of people who call another group an enemy, expect horrible things to happen. People love validation, feeling important/useful, so in situations where they grow up knowing that they're constantly under threat, it's easy to persuade them to do horrible things. Just look at all the various conflicts happening across the world right now, many situations where it's just one group fighting a slightly less evil group. One thing remains the same though, that civilians and innocent people will always die in conflicts. I worked drones in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Somalia. Over the years I worked that job, I witnessed some truly horrific things. ISIS was on another level with the cruelty they showed. The crucifixion of a family of 4 in the middle of a traffic roundabout. A man chained and dragged behind a truck until his body literally fell apart. People locked in iron cages and burned alive. Watched men beg for their lives while praying, kneeling at the mouth of a dry well, guns to their heads. Brazilian elections in 2018 were a revelation too. Bolsonaro, that was elected, openly praised the work of a known torturer in the Brazilian dictatorship amongst other things, even though some of the people that suffered through this man's hands were still alive. People knew it, and they just laughed and agree with it, amongst many other things. Millions of people in my country heard him defending those things and identified with him enough to vote for him. I still can't wrap my head around it. Lived in South America for a few years. Once walked into a home that was actually just a 10 by 10 foot room with a bed and a sink. Literally a family of 10 in the single bed, the smell was atrocious. A little girl in the bed covered in dirt and I broke down crying the second I walked out. Don't know if this conveys how truly horrifying that was, but it gave me a worse feeling than these next ones. Was talking to a couple guys outside an alley in the favela, trying to get them to come play soccer with us. One of them was the son of this lady I worked with. They were obviously in a gang. I have a glass bottle of Coke and offered him some, he's drinking it and we're talking, all of a sudden a guy comes around the corner and one of his friends says, "Hey, isn't that the guy?" They all immediately jumped him, the guy I gave the bottle to smashed it over his head and started stabbing him in the throat continuously with the shards. The rest of the guys were all kicking him and beating on him. The body was still there when I walked by later. Once discovered a woman's body with a rope around its neck while walking through a field. Had been there a while. Once knew a blind disabled man who I talked to in passing sometimes. One day I don't see him and ask a neighbor, he got jumped, stabbed to death by 4 men. 13-year-old girl dating a 30-year-old. He has a wonderful job, so her mom didn't have a problem with it. Probably have more, but those stuck out in my head. Not me, but my grandfather escaped North Korea. He's had a crazy life and saw some horrible things, worse things he said he saw. He only ever told me once was seeing a mother and father being publicly executed in front their son because they said something bad about Kim Il-sung's son and stole food. The other worst thing he said he saw was when he was 6. It was 1944 during the Japanese occupation of Korea, and he witnessed guerrilla fighters ambush Japanese soldiers and seeing one of the guerrilla fighters dig gold teeth out of a wounded Japanese soldier with a knife, then torture him, cutting his fingers off to give up the location of other Japanese units. He said his screaming and crying still haunts him. Once in the early evening I saw a woman being attacked in the street. After attempting to intervene, I went into a nearby fast food place to ask for help. It was completely packed. Dead silent. Big windows. Every single person in there had also seen this woman being attacked and none of them had done anything about it. Even when I described the situation and asked someone to call the police, they all just stared at me slack-jawed, like zombies. Then someone got their food and walked right past this man punching a woman in the street to get to their car. It was the most soul-crushing moment of my life. When the police finally arrived, the woman was trying to downplay what happened and agreed to go home with her attacker when he showed back up at the scene. I wonder, if all those people hadn't ignored her, would she have had the confidence to choose differently? My own family gaslighting me about my son having autism, then about my other son having a brain tumor, then about my son with autism having leukemia. It took him dying for them to take any of this seriously. I was accused of pandering for money. I was left alone as a single mother to deal with this. I lived in poverty because in caring for my sick children I could not afford to work. My family is well off. They refused to help me. When my car broke down, a car was purchased on my behalf. I had no say in what car was purchased or how much was spent, but I was given a dollar amount to repay every month to compensate for the purchase. No, I don't have a history of being a drug addict, irresponsible, mentally ill or any other destructive thing. I did, however, tell school counselors back in high school about the abuse going on in our family. My father was a narcissist. I was the family scapegoat. Nestlé's plot to improve sales of the baby formula by leading to starving infants in third world countries. It's such a cackling cartoon supervillain plot, so blatantly, unambiguously, clearly evil, I just fail to imagine the scenario by which it was approved as something to be enacted. And equally, I fail to understand how a corporation so clearly and blatantly evil remains successful on the market. This is the darkness of humanity at its finest. These things aren't supposed to exist outside stupid movies for kids, they certainly aren't supposed to happen in real life. I heard this from a social worker who used to run an orphanage. They used to do regular trips around towns and cities to save needy children. Once during what they thought would be a regular trip around town, they heard an infant crying and stray dogs barking. The surprising thing was it was coming from somewhere near a dumpster. They rush there and what they see is a newborn, minutes or hours old, still covered in fluids and with the umbilical cord still attached to it just lying there on cold hard concrete. With dogs just surrounding it, sniffing it. Sorry, my memory fails me, and I don't know if the child survived, because by the time the person came to the part where they said they took the child back to the orphanage I was bawling my eyes out. This isn't the most violent or brutal thing I've seen or personally experienced, but it sticks with me. My MIL died suddenly, so my husband and I were staying with my FIL for the funeral. It was the first time in many years we had been there. When we arrived, I learned that my MIL's housekeeper/companion, I will refer to her as J, that had lived with them for many years was in the end stages of lung cancer. She was under hospice care but still living in my in-laws' house. My SAL explained that J was constantly faking it to get attention from FIL, and that J had no business still staying there. I hadn't seen J yet, so I wasn't sure what to make of SAL's comments. Soon after my SAL said these things, we started hearing moans and cries coming from Jay's room. My SAL said Jay was being dramatic and just trying to get attention, so she wasn't going in the room to check on her. My husband, who is a RN, went in to see Jay and gave her pain meds. I finally saw Jay the next morning. I have never seen anyone that looked like her, and I have seen loved ones die from cancer before. She was a barely coherent skeleton that felt pain when you gave her the lightest touch. It was horrific. I spent time sitting with Jay when I could. My husband looked after her as well. My SAL never stopped complaining and accusing Jay of faking pain for attention from FIL. I never saw her show a single shred of anything but resentment and disgust toward Jay. Fortunately, Jay passed the day I left, and her suffering ended. The reason these sticks with me is that until then I adored my SAL. She's a loving mom and family member. She and her husband pride themselves in being good Christians faced with rolling eyes and are known as good people. The casual cruelty exhibited by my SAL is still shocking to me. I cannot understand how anyone could remain unmoved by the immensity of this poor woman's suffering. I can't believe that I never suspected she was capable of such, and I don't use this word lightly, banal evil. I will never ever look at SIL the same way and am glad we live across the country from her. I'm too old and busy to spend time with people that disgust me. Mom had a developmentally delayed tween. She was hooked on drugs and was only ever home to sleep and drop food for the kid, who had the capacity of a 6-year-old. He was living in filth, with rotting food and filled diapers everywhere. Oh, did I not mention that rather than clean the house and fix the broken toilet, she just put diapers on the kid? He took off after using it, and left around the house to fester, because he didn't know any better? That poor kid deserved so much better. There were support networks available to help him and the mom, but she just chose not to try. He's with a foster family now, thank God. But the level of squalor and filth he had to endure for over a decade was reprehensible. When I was in Afghanistan, one of our companies had a mass casualty event when a suicide bomber detonated himself in a bazaar, wounding a dozen Americans and killing an Afghan interpreter and several civilians. They found the head of the bomber, which is an exceptionally creepy thing no matter any human head it is, and discovered it was a teenage boy. He had been attending a local madrasa that preached the virtue of suicide bombing, and decided it was worth taking his own life in order to possibly kill some Americans. Joke's on him, I guess, as all of our people survived. It was really a hardening experience to see how even children can be brainwashed into doing such depraved acts. Kangaroo Court. Well, the aftermath. More than once. Someone was accused of burglary. I assume the accusation stemmed from catching the person red-handed. Nevertheless, they beat his brains out with a rock and threw his corpse on a pile of burning tires. Once the community leaders were satisfied that he was suitably burned, they allowed the fire service, us, in to extinguish the scene. The dead guy was unimportant to me. Kinda dimes a dozen once you've seen enough. What struck me was the carnival atmosphere surrounding the event. People singing and celebrating. Small children dancing, cars parked around blasting music. It's such a complicated situation that precedes these things, and I do try to be understanding, but in those moments I hated those people. Murderers all, in my eyes. Last April, the 2023 Sudanese war began. We barely got out of the country on July 17th. A paramilitary group, called the RSF, versus the country's military. The RSF shouldn't even be called a paramilitary group. They plunder houses, loot the residents and their houses, strip search them, take what they want, then burn their homes down. In some instances, they whipped the men, then shot them dead in front of their families. We got some of our stuff stolen. That was it. Others had it way worse. Literal war criminals. Sad news, my father and mother's relatives are still there. Sad, but my own mother. She abused me and my brothers physically and mentally for years. She would not let us see our father for 3 years until I was 16 and decided I had enough and left the house. She would call us regularly to try and instigate conspiracies against our father. Recently I discovered that she stole from our trust fund after she divorced and changed the private company it was in her name, so we will probably never see that money that belonged to us anyway. The worst part is that I have tried a lot of times to mend our relationship, but every time I bring everything up she just denies anything that happened. She had me questioning reality, and I actually had to ask my brother a couple of times to indeed confirm that everything had happened. Anyways, I developed several traumas, anxiety disorder and depression, but I am working on all of that. It just baffles me how evil you can be even to your own children. I know she must be ill, but I still keep a lot of anger in my heart, and I am not ready to forgive her. She does not deserve that from me or my brothers. The worst thing I saw was a man beating his wife in the backyard a few houses over from where I was doing volunteer work. I thought her screams I originally thought were children playing, until I saw him knock her down and start punching her. If we count the internet, funky town. If you know, you know. My so dealt with way more and has some terrifying stories. She had an abusive father who was embarrassed by her severe anxiety. She doesn't talk about his abuse as much, but she has told me it was emotional and physical. She was sent to some of those troubled teen camps in Mexico. She told me a story of one girl she knew that was handcuffed to a stretcher that was too small for her, so she was on the floor. My so was not allowed to speak to her. My so had walked in on this girl trying to hang herself. She got SA'd there too by another kid there, luckily didn't get too far into it. The guy apparently harassed another girl. This girl was seen walking out of one of the bathrooms shocked, but the school put her into their version of solitary confinement after as punishment, handcuffed to a chair in a dark room without food. According to my so, that girl was the only one to get solitary while she was there. The school went out of business during the pandemic. Its sister program still runs though. No one got justice. I was 20 years old doing some missionary work in a rough neighborhood in America. I was talking to some high school kids about Jesus on the street, and 2 families brought their toddlers out of their houses and into the street near we were at. Then the families told their toddlers to fight. A crowd watched as these 2 toddlers fought in the street. There was blood, lots of crying and lots of screaming. By the end of the fight one child was lying in the street limp. That's the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. I was waiting for the bus in downtown Pittsburgh in 2015 and caught the aftermath of a woman who was being carted away on a gurney. I gathered that a truck hit her making a left turn while she was in the crosswalk. The thing that really blew my mind is how many people were recording the whole thing like they were trying to get the next viral video. Poor lady. Hearsay, but I was told that apparently one young university student had unprotected affair, was horrified by pregnancy and the prospect of looking into abortion, which is legally allowed but has cultural stigma there, so eventually she gave birth in the street and drowned the baby in a pond in the campus. I didn't bother to learn about the rest of the details, but she either received zero help or outright refused them. Something could have been done to prevent this. I was stuck for an hour on a train home when someone jumped in front of a train at my local station. When I got off, you could tell the area it happened towards the end of the platform as it was sectioned off by tape and police were blocking it. Multiple people tried sneaking past or going onto the covered bridge that connects platforms and trying to open windows to get a peek with their phone cameras on. I felt disgusted at the fascination of wanting to see the end result of someone trying to kill themselves in a gruesome way. When I was in the military, we had an assignment/task where we would guard the synagogues in coalition with the police. At our brief summary of the reasoning behind it, they told us about the incidents of terrorism on religious sites. They then showed us footage which was live streamed by the man who did the horrific thing. He came into a mosque. I know synagogue and mosque are two different religious sites, but it was to show what one should expect, armed with an AR, quiet, and then began picking off the people in there one by one. Seeing it from the terrorist perspective was disturbing and horrific. He even pulled the trigger on the people who had already been hit just to be sure. Seeing that made me very committed to doing my part to not let that happen. It was awful to say the least. I already had a hate for terrorists before, but this death fueled it. I went to this place called the Elon School when I was a teenager. It was an absolute horror show of reform school. While I could say the school itself was the darkest, in reality the stories of the physical and abuse my fellow residents shared were some of the darkest things I have ever heard. It makes it worse to think they were also suffering in the hell of Elon after all they endured. Two things that happened in my hometown also are up there. One was when a guy walked up and stabbed an 8-year-old to death at random and in broad daylight. The other is a high school classmate, before I went to Elon, got pregnant and hid it from her family. She had the baby and abandoned it in a construction porta-john. She suddenly had a guilty conscience, but the baby died before she got back to it. I work as a firefighter. In one of the heavy calls, I had to carry the charred corpse of an old woman out of a burning house through a small window. The normal ways were blocked. After the liquidation, I was sitting on the grass, having a small smoke break. A kid of about 13 years old was standing next to me, looking at the smoldering embers. All the books burned. It's a pity. I hope very much that this is a protective reaction of the brain. Because when I came back to the unit, I found out that this boy was the grandson of that woman. He burned matches in the barn, and then just watched the fire until the neighbors called us. I hope it's a defensive reaction to fright and stress, because if not, selfishness on the verge of psychopathy, absolute indifference, and coldness against the backdrop of a smoldering grandmother. It's creepy. Crowded line at airport immigration. The crowd in flight were from China, and no matter how much room was in the line area, everyone just packed tight and stayed pushed to the front. One woman lost consciousness, and the line parted like the Red Sea, and they let her hit the floor. Not a single person attempted to catch her. After she got to the floor, the hole that opened for her fell close back up and they all stood over her. Had to fight my way through to help the poor lady, and made me really question how people could be so cruel that day. I've seen much worse on video and TV, but for my own eyes, this stood out. I went to a Catholic college, and I was an RA. I had a resident who actively went to campus ministry where ironically I was also the intern. I felt like the nuns I worked with were humanists who believed in helping people at all costs. As a result, I encouraged him to come and just spend time with us and make friends. A year later he comes in looking disheveled, so we start talking. He comes out as gay, to which I'm like, congrats, that's awesome, thank you for telling me. The head nun then turns around and yells at him about how it's a sin. Keep in mind we have a pride flag sitting behind her head and a sign that says this is a safe space. The guy, obviously having a ton of feels in the moment, leaves. I try to have a normal conversation with this nun when she threatened to fire me. Long story short, I went above her head, and she got transferred. But the damage was done. I graduated the next year and was out of there. Then unfortunately, I'm reading the news at work and see that the very same kid who she pushed out of that safe space took his life down the hall from the campus ministry. He never told anyone else he was gay as far as I know. Some nuns are real worst. This girl got pregnant at the place I worked at. She was homeless at the time but chose to intentionally get pregnant anyway with one of the guys she was talking to, which was several. He was in the military and at the time they had been together for 3 weeks when they chose to have the child. He then went to Florida and ghosted her after she said she was pregnant even though they both planned to have it. I asked her what she was going to do. She had massive credit debt and lived in her truck. In addition to that, her family ostracized her because of the pregnancy. So, I was asking her how she planned to raise this child as a single mother. Usually, I'm completely opposed to abortion, but in this situation I feel so sorry for that poor child. She is still vaping, having unprotected affairs with other guys, and drinking to my knowledge as a 4-month pregnant soon-to-be single homeless mother. I also asked her if adoption was on the table. Her response to me asking if adoption or abortion were on the table was this: I'd rather have an abortion than give it up for adoption. Even though I'd be killing it would still be mine if I killed it. If I give it up for adoption it wouldn't be mine anymore. I told her I had to go to the bathroom, and I cried. I felt so sorry for the unborn child. No child deserves the life it's soon going to be plummeted into or the mother she's going to be. That is by far the worst thing anyone has ever said to me. It's the most twisted comment I've ever heard and made me kind of hate humanity for a few days. When I was deployed, C-7S, large cargo planes, would occasionally fly into our flight line to offload thousands of dead bodies from the city the fighting was occurring in. I have no idea who the people were or what they did with the bodies. I just recall seeing them all laid out with white sheets over top. When I got home I saw a Vice video where they went into the very same city and discovered rooms full of partially buried bodies. Elderly. Women. Children. All just people caught up in a war of conflicting ideologies. The images of the bodies in those rooms occasionally haunt my dreams. I walked up on the immediate aftermath of a teenager getting shot in the neck in a gang shooting across the street from my apartment in NYC. He was basically still fully conscious and just sprawled on the pavement. A crowd of people immediately formed at the stop of the apartment, and everyone was just filming the guy on Facebook Live. As I walked into my apartment, I was coming from the subway. My neighbors told me that I'd get used to it. The police officers showed up and basically ignored the kid while they taped off the scene. I was so shocked that I basically tried to ignore it but caught a few glimpses of this kid through the front window just slowly bleeding out while the police officers stepped over him and the people in the street filmed it and joked about it. The ambulance took him away after a little while and he died that night. I get that he was gang affiliated, but the fact that so many people, mostly adults, could not only watch but film a teenager dying in the street without any concern was overwhelming to me. It shook me for a long time and it's one of the main reasons I gave up my visa and left the US to move back to Europe. I don't know how people can joke about anyone dying, let alone a teenager. And a teenager who lives in a country that creates a level of oppression that leads to the creation of gangs in the first place. The whole thing was so dark on multiple levels. I don't know how anyone can think it's okay to make jokes about a dying teenager for internet influence. I worked in an immigration firm this past summer as an intern. I was able to meet most of the clients and help them write their affidavits. Every single client that came in had some of the most heart-wrenching stories I had ever heard. Almost all of the women had been assaulted as a child or as an adult. I would say most everyone, men and women, had grown up in a tumultuous environment with an abusive parent. I would often cry in the office when reading, interviewing, or helping write the affidavits. It was so hard to hear these stories and to know how many hardships the clients had endured. The U-Visa cases were the worst ones. Broken heart. Not me personally, but a very close friend who was into drugs once talked about going to a drug dealer in one of those old market areas in my city, Karachi, and when he was dealing with the guys over there he saw a man with a little girl who was presumably his daughter come looking for his fix. Apparently he had no money, and he left the child for the dealers, took his fix, and told him he'll be back in a couple of hours, and they can have her in the meantime. Yes, humanity is dead. Interviewing kids who crossed the U.S. southern border for reunification purposes. One of the worst stories I came across was of a girl who started out with her mom, dad, and little sisters. She and her dad head out to get food one day while passing through Mexico only to come back and find her mom and sisters gone from their hiding spot. Dad and she continue on alone. A taxi driver attempted to abduct her, and her dad fought the man. More people got involved and it became a melee. She had to run and is separated from her dad and makes it to the border herself. I don't know what happened to her or her family afterwards, but it haunts me. While at elementary school, there was a group of guys, I want to say about 7 to 9 of them, could be over or under younger, life is a blur. I had always been targeted by this group, because I had recently moved from the south and I have an accent, and also I didn't have a dad. He had abandoned my family when I was 5. I had moved out of the school 5th grade for unrelated reasons, but apparently the guys had also been bullying each other, especially after one of the boys' father killed himself. It was before I moved, but it has been happening. The boy had always wanted to be like his dad, not in killing himself, but in other reasons. While I was in my 6th period in middle school, I got a text from my ex who was good friends with this one guy telling me apparently he had killed himself because his friends had driven him to do it like his dad had. He was about 13 then, I think. It hurts so much, and it's sickening to know that his own friends bullied him to kill himself. Psychiatric hospital when I was 17. I have quite a few stories from my time there, but the one that really hit me was a 13-year-old that was detoxing off K2, synthetic marijuana. His parents were drug addicts and would leave him in a multitude of different psychiatric hospitals year-round to get rid of him. Police found him in the bathtub after overdosing on K2. He was in the bathtub for 3 days before anyone found him. The look in his eyes and the stories he told me made me realize that I'm very blessed, even if I struggle with depression every day. I'll truly never forget that kid.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.